What happens when a Hollywood legend steps into a trap set by a talk show host with a venomous tongue? Harrison Ford, the man who brought Indiana Jones and Han Solo to life, walked onto Steven's stage expecting a friendly chat. Instead, he found himself ambushed, his legacy torn apart by a grinning host who thought he could outwit a star who'd seen it all. The air crackled with hostility from the moment Harrison sat down, his jaw tight, eyes narrowing at Steven's smug face. This wasn't just a late-night interview. It was a battle, one that would leave the audience gasping and Harrison fighting to defend his name. The show began with Steven leaning back in his chair, his smile sharp as a blade. He didn't waste time. "So, Harrison," he said, voice dripping with mockery. "You've been in, what, 100 movies? But let's be honest, most folks only care about the old ones. Indiana Jones, Star Wars, that's your peak, right? Everything else just coasts on that glory." The crowd laughed, but it was uneasy, sensing the jab. Harrison's face hardened, his fingers gripping the armrest. He wasn't here to be a punching bag. "You saying I've got nothing new to offer?" he shot back, his voice low, dangerous. Steven shrugged, feigning innocence. "I'm just saying some stars fade. Maybe it's time to hang up the fedora." The audience gasped, the tension spiking like a thunderstorm about to break. Harrison leaned forward, his eyes locked on Steven's. "You think you can sit there and sum up my life in a soundbite? I've been making films while you were still cracking jokes in a basement." The crowd roared, some cheering, others stunned. Steven's smile faltered, but he doubled down, his voice turning icy. "Oh, come on, Harrison, you're a relic. Hollywood's moved on. You're just cashing checks for nostalgia." The words hit like a slap, and Harrison's face flushed with anger. He wasn't just defending his career. This was personal, a public attack on everything he'd built over decades of sweat and sacrifice. The stage felt smaller, the space between them shrinking as their voices grew louder. Steven pressed harder, sensing blood. "Let's talk about your last film. Critics called it forgettable. Are you even trying anymore? Or is it just about the paycheck?" Harrison's laugh was bitter, cutting. "You want to talk effort? Try carrying a franchise on your back while hosts like you nitpick from the sidelines. You wouldn't last a day on a set." The audience was on edge, some shouting support for Harrison, others egging Steven on. It was chaos, a verbal cage, match with no referee. Steven leaned closer, his eyes glinting with malice. "Maybe you're just too old to keep up. Ever think of that?" The crowd went silent, the insult hanging heavy. Harrison stood, his chair scraping the floor, towering over the desk. "You don't get to talk to me like that," he growled, pointing a finger. "I've earned my place. You're just a guy with a microphone and too much ego." The audience erupted, the noise deafening. Steven tried to laugh it off, but his voice shook. He'd pushed too far, and Harrison wasn't backing down. The segment cut to commercial, but the fight was far from over. Harrison sat back down, his glare promising more, while Steven scrambled to regain control, his plan unraveling. The commercial break ended, and the cameras rolled again, catching Harrison Ford's unyielding stare. A predator sizing up prey. Steven, visibly rattled, adjusted his tie, his grin now a thin mask over panic. He'd planned to humiliate a legend, to boost his show's ratings with a viral clip, but Harrison wasn't playing the victim. The audience, still buzzing from the earlier clash, leaned forward, sensing the fight was about to explode. This wasn't just a talk show anymore. It was a public reckoning, and Steven was on the ropes. Steven cleared his throat, trying to pivot. "All right, Harrison, let's talk about something else. Your new project, that action flick. Some say it's a desperate grab to stay relevant." His voice was sharp, a jab meant to wound. Harrison's eyes flashed, his patience gone. "Desperate? You think I need to prove myself to you?" he snapped, his voice booming across the studio. "I've been in this game longer than you've had a career. You don't get to judge my choices. The crowd cheered, their loyalty shifting to Harrison, who sat tall, radiating defiance. Stephen, desperate to claw back control, leaned over his desk, his tone venomous. Come on, Harrison. You're almost 80. Why keep doing stunts? You're not fooling anyone. It's sad watching you cling to the spotlight. The words were cruel, designed to sting, and they did. Harrison's face tightened, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he stood again, slowly, deliberately, his presence commanding the room. Sad? You want to talk sad? He said, his voice low, cutting like a blade. What's sad is a host who builds his name by tearing others down. You're not a journalist. You're a bully with a laugh track. The audience gasped, then roared, some standing to applaud. Stephen's face reddened, his cool facade crumbling. He slammed his hand on the desk, startling the crew. A bully? That's rich, coming from a guy who phones in every role. You're a has-been, Harrison, and everyone knows it. The insult echoed, raw and vicious, but Harrison didn't budge. He stepped closer to the desk, his shadow falling over Stephen. You think you can break me with cheap shots? He growled. I've faced worse than you and walked away stronger. You're nothing but noise. The tension was unbearable. The studio a pressure cooker ready to burst. A producer in the wings signaled frantically, urging Stephen to cut to another segment, but he ignored it, too deep in his own trap. He stood now, matching Harrison's height, though his confidence wavered. You're proving my point, Stephen hissed. All bluster, no substance. Hollywood's done with you and you can't handle it. Harrison's laugh was cold, dangerous. Hollywood? I am Hollywood. You're just a guy who talks about it. Know the difference. The crowd was electric, shouting Harrison's name, drowning out Stephen's attempt to respond. For a moment, Stephen looked small, exposed, his plan to humiliate Harrison backfiring spectacularly. He opened his mouth, but Harrison cut him off, his voice steady, lethal. You wanted a fight, you got one, but you're out of your league. He sat back down, arms crossed, daring Stephen to keep going. Stephen, flustered, fumbled his notes, his next question dying in his throat. The segment ended abruptly, the cameras panning to the cheering crowd, but the war wasn't over. Harrison's eyes promised he'd finish this, and Stephen's nervous glance showed he knew he'd lost ground. Harrison Ford sat like a king on a throne, his arms crossed, eyes burning into Stephen, who scrambled to salvage his crumbling show. The audience, still chanting Harrison's name, had turned the studio into a coliseum, and Stephen was the gladiator, on the verge of defeat. But he wasn't done yet. His face twisted with a new resolve, a desperate need to strike back. He tossed his notes aside, leaning forward, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. You think you're untouchable, Harrison? Let's get real. You've been coasting on luck your whole career. Without Lucas and Spielberg, you'd be nobody. The accusation landed like a grenade, the crowd gasping, torn between shock and anticipation. Harrison's jaw clenched, his calm facade cracking just enough to show the fire beneath. Luck? He said, his voice a low rumble, each word deliberate. I clawed my way up from nothing. You think I got handed Indiana Jones? I fought for every role while you were still dreaming of a stage. He leaned forward, his presence overwhelming, making Stephen shrink in his chair. Don't talk to me about luck. You wouldn't know what it takes to survive in my world. The audience erupted, their cheers a tidal wave, but Stephen, cornered, lashed out with a cruelty that stunned everyone. Oh, please, Stephen spat, his eyes narrowing. You're not some hero. You're a guy who got famous playing pretend. And off-screen? You're a mess. Crashed planes, broken marriages. You're a walking disaster. The personal attack was vicious, dragging Harrison's private life into the spotlight. The crowd went silent, the air thick with unease. Harrison's face darkened, his hands balling into fists. For a moment it seemed he might lunge across, the desk, but he stayed rooted, his voice icy. "You want to go there? You think dragging my life through the mud makes you a man? You're pathetic, picking at scars to hide how small you are." Stephen smirked, sensing a crack in Harrison's armor. "Truth hurts, doesn't it? You're not the legend you think you are. Just a guy who got lucky and can't let go." The taunt was reckless, a final swing from a man with nothing left to lose. Harrison stood, slowly, his height casting a long shadow over the set. "You don't know me," he said, his voice steady but laced with fury. "You read gossip and think it's truth. I've lived through more than you'll ever understand, and I'm still standing. Can you say the same?" The crowd roared back to life, their support a wall of sound behind him. Stephen, rattled, tried to interrupt, but Harrison wasn't done. He stepped around the desk, closing the distance, his voice rising. "You want to talk messes? Look in the mirror. You tear people down to feel big, but it's not working tonight. You picked the wrong fight." The audience was on its feet, some shouting encouragement, others stunned by the raw intensity. Stephen stood too, but his bravado was gone, his hands trembling slightly. "You're out of line," he stammered, but Harrison cut him off, pointing a finger. "No, you're out of line. You crossed it when you made this personal. Now you deal with the consequences." The producer signaled wildly from the sidelines, but the cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of the showdown. Stephen, cornered, tried one last jab. "You'll regret this, Harrison. You're done." Harrison's laugh was sharp, unyielding. "Done? I'm just getting started." He turned to the audience, raising a hand, and they exploded, drowning out Stephen's weak retort. The segment didn't cut this time. The crew was too stunned to act. Harrison returned to his seat, his glare daring Stephen to try again, while Stephen sank into his chair, his confidence shattered, knowing he'd lost the room and the fight. Harrison Ford's glare could have burned a hole through steel, his silence louder than the audience's fading cheers. Stephen, slumped in his chair, looked like a man who'd bet everything and lost, but his eyes still flickered with defiance, a cornered animal ready to bite. The studio was a powder keg, every breath heavy with the promise of another explosion. Stephen straightened, his voice hoarse but venomous, refusing to surrender. "You think you've won, Harrison? You're just a loud old man yelling at shadows. This show's mine, and I'll bury you." The threat was bold, desperate, and the crowd hissed, sensing the fight wasn't over. Harrison's lips curled into a grim smile, his voice steady, cutting. "Bury me? You can't even stand up to me. You're all talk, Stephen, and everyone sees it now." He leaned back, arms crossed, daring Stephen to swing again. The audience murmured, their loyalty cemented to Harrison, who'd turned their hero into a warrior. Stephen's hands shook as he gripped the desk, his face a mask of rage. "You're delusional," he snarled. "You think these people care about you? They're here for the drama, not your tired comeback story." The words were a low blow, dismissing Harrison's connection with his fans. Harrison stood, his movements slow, deliberate, like a storm gathering strength. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice booming, filling the room. "These people aren't here for you. They're here because I've given them stories, heroes, moments that last." "What have you given them?" Snark and cheap laughs. The crowd roared, some standing, their applause a thunderclap. Stephen flinched, his plan to tear Harrison down now a public failure. But he wasn't finished. He rose, pointing at Harrison, his voice shrill. "You're nothing without your fans. I made you relevant tonight, and you hate me for it." The accusation was a wild swing, and Harrison's eyes narrowed, his patience gone. "You made me relevant?" he growled, stepping closer, his shadow looming over Stephen. "I've been relevant since before you were born. You're the one begging for scraps, using my name to get eyes on your show." The audience gasped, then cheered, their energy fueling Harrison's fire. Stephen's face twisted, his voice cracking. "You're a fraud. a washed-up star who can't face the truth. The insult was desperate, but it only made Harrison stronger. Harrison leaned over the desk, inches from Stephen's face, his voice low, lethal. The truth? Here's the truth. I've poured my life into this work, taken risks you'd never dare. You sit here, safe, judging me, but you've never created anything real. You're a parasite, Stephen, and I'm done with you. The crowd exploded, their cheers deafening, some chanting Harrison's name. Stephen staggered back, his bravado gone, his eyes wide with shock. He'd pushed too far, and Harrison had stripped him bare in front of millions. The producer, frantic, tried to signal the crew to cut, but the cameras stayed on, capturing Stephen's collapse. He sank into his chair, muttering, "This isn't over," but his voice was weak, drowned by the audience's roar. Harrison didn't sit. He turned to the crowd, raising a hand, and they answered with a wave of applause that shook the studio. He'd taken Stephen's stage and made it his own, a legend reclaiming his throne. Stephen's head bowed, his defeat undeniable, but the final blow was coming, and Harrison was ready to deliver it. Harrison Ford stood at the edge of the stage, his silhouette framed by the audience's thunderous applause, a titan unbroken by Stephen's vicious onslaught. Stephen, hunched in his chair, looked like a man who'd gambled his career and lost, his muttered threats swallowed by the crowd's fervor. The studio was alive, vibrating with the energy of a battle won, but Harrison wasn't finished. He turned back to Stephen, his eyes sharp, unyielding, ready to seal the victory with words that would echo far beyond the night. This wasn't just a win, it was a reckoning, and Stephen would never forget it. Stephen, grasping for one last shred of control, forced a laugh, his voice brittle. "You think you're a hero now, Harrison? You're just a loudmouth who got a few cheers." The jab was weak, a dying ember, but it still stung. Harrison's face tightened, and he stepped back to the desk, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "A loudmouth? I'm the guy who showed up and faced you. You're the one hiding behind insults, too scared to stand for anything real." The audience roared, their voices a wall of sound, and Stephen's smirk vanished, his defeat laid bare. Harrison leaned closer, his presence overwhelming, every word a hammer strike. "You wanted to tear me down, Stephen, but you forgot something. I've built something you'll never touch. Not with your cheap shots, not with your show. I've got stories, films, a legacy that outlives us both." The crowd was on its feet, some wiping tears, others shouting his name. Stephen opened his mouth, but no words came. He was done, exposed as a small man who'd overplayed his hand. Harrison straightened, his voice rising, final. "You don't get to define me. I define myself, and I'm not going anywhere." The studio shook with applause, a tidal wave of admiration for the man who'd turned an ambush into a triumph. Stephen slumped further, his hands limp on the desk, his eyes avoiding Harrison's. He'd wanted a viral moment, but Harrison had stolen it, turning the night into a celebration of his resilience. The producer, sensing the end, finally signaled. The crew and the cameras zoomed in on Harrison, who turned to the audience, raising both hands. The cheers grew louder, a chorus of loyalty that drowned out Stephen's silence. Harrison didn't sit again. He stepped toward the stage's edge, addressing the crowd directly. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice steady, warm. "It's about everyone who's ever been counted out, told they're done. You keep going, you fight. That's what matters." The words hit hard, resonating with the audience, who clapped and stomped, some nodding through tears. It was more than a victory over Stephen. It was a rallying cry, a reminder of why Harrison Ford was a legend. Stephen, forgotten in his own studio, stared at the floor, his show hijacked by the man he'd tried to destroy. The cameras panned away, focusing on Harrison as he waved to the crowd, his face alight with quiet pride. The segment ended, but the moment lived on, a story of a giant who'd faced a bully and won, not with fists but with truth. Harrison left the stage to deafening cheers, his head high, while Stephen sat alone, the weight of his failure crushing him. The audience knew they'd witnessed something unforgettable, a battle that proved Harrison Ford was still, and always would be, a force no one could break.